Good day and welcome to this Huntington Learning Center webinar, Navigating the Path to College Acceptances. As you all know, if you have students that are getting ready for the college experience, this is a really critical time. And so we're very pleased to have an excellent speaker tonight, or an excellent group of speakers tonight, to discuss how you can best navigate this process. So a little bit about Huntington before we get into today's content. Huntington's been around for over 45 years, and we're a leading tutoring and test prep organization serving students in grades K through 12. And there are three things about Huntington that I really think differentiate us from other programs or going out and just hiring a tutor. And the first is every program that we have is taught by a highly trained and certified tutor. In fact, the Huntington training team has one of the best and most nationally recognized tutoring and training programs in the country. So we're very proud of that. Huntington is also accredited by the Middle States Association of Colleges and Schools. And the reason why this is important is because as your child goes through their academic journey, they're going to seek degrees, certifications, and other kinds of things. And normally any school that has a degree is going to be accredited by Middle States Association of Colleges and Schools. And we think that's important to maintain that consistency. And third, and I think probably one of the most important differentiators, is that Huntington uses a targeted, individualized learning program approach to really help students improve in the areas that they need to improve in. And really, the results do speak for themselves. And on average, in about 3 months, Huntington students see a total average increase of about 2.2 grade levels in reading and in math. And then when we talk about SAT and ACT, the college entrance exams, the prep programs, we typically see an average increase of 229 points on the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT. We also work with students on scholarship offers, and what we've seen in the past is students have averaged over $71,000. And I think last year's total was over $187 million in scholarship offers. So that's definitely something significant when you consider the cost of college. Now, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker, Jeff Selingo. We've had Jeff on before, and as you may or may not know, he's a world-renowned journalist and author. He's authored 3 books on higher education, including 2 New York Times bestsellers. And so I'm going to turn things over to Jeff, who's going to guide us through the rest of this presentation. Jeff?
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate your time tonight. And given it's January, and by now, most applications for high school seniors were due this month, so I'm going to assume that most on tonight's calls are juniors, sophomores, or first-year students, freshmen in high school. And so we're going to start out with how to think about the college search in front of you by explaining the ecosystem of higher education so you can best filter the choices that are available to you, and we'll talk about how that choice set has even changed. In recent years, we'll talk about the application process and what matters most to colleges. And that's when I'll be joined by someone who has really been on that side of the desk, on the college side of the desk, and that's Rick Clark from Georgia Tech, who's also co-author of a fantastic book that I highly recommend to parents and students who are starting or in the college search, The Truth About College Admission, A Family Guide to Getting In and Staying Together. And we'll talk to Rick for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll finish off talking about money and the role high school grades and test scores play there. And hopefully save some time for Q&A as well. So let's get started. I love this map because it just shows how big higher ed is in the US. 40% of the market is under 1,000 students. The number and breadth of institutions can really overwhelm, I think, families as they think about paying for higher education, as they think about embarking on the college search, because it's just such a wide open choice set that's almost unlike anything else that you're going to purchase in life. So I want to break it down for you so that this big number feels a bit smaller to you as you begin your search. I think most people make the mistake when they start their search of trying to put down names of colleges, places they heard of. Maybe you went there, maybe relatives did, places you hear about in your community or school, etc. I want to encourage you to hold off on the names for a minute and think about a few other factors first. So let's pretend for a minute that you're at the eye doctor, and you remember when they show you that chart and then they flip through all the lenses in front of you. Well, let's do the same thing here. And here's the first lens I want you to think about when filtering this map, as you can see on this next slide. So the first lens you should think about is the 2-year, 4-year lens. Do you want to go to a 2-year college, start at a 2-year college, or go to a 4-year college? And then the second lens is really public and private. And I think there's a few things to consider here. One is that most students go to public colleges and universities, right? When you include community colleges and add them together with the public 4-year sector, you're talking about nearly 70%. But yet one important thing to consider is that if you look at the majority of the top 30 national universities, for example, in the US News and World Report rankings, or they're private. If you look at the Wall Street Journal rankings and you use rankings, and we'll be talking more about the rankings later, 14, the top 14 are all private in the Wall Street Journal rankings. And I think a lot of the discussion in the news media is about private colleges and universities. So you probably think that 31% number who go to private colleges, universities is much larger, but it isn't. So I think that as you start to think about this, to really think about the wide open array of institutions that are available, both public and private. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these three groupings in the next slide and give you some more details about each of them. So there's a few factors to consider as you think about the three groupings here. First is that I think community colleges are incredibly popular with students who think of it as a transfer option. In fact, when you look at the statistics, 80% of students who go to community colleges want to transfer to 4-year colleges, but it's important to note that only 20% do, and only 11% end up getting a 4-year degree. So it is a tough path for transfer, and that's for various reasons at many community colleges, not every community college, but I think if you're considering a community college to start off with, and then you want to transfer to a 4-year college, make sure that you really look at the transfer pathways that are available at your local community college to your local state or state universities. Because if that transfer pathway is not automatic or easy, I think that should be a red flag. And it's also important, I think, to know that many colleges and universities now are offering, including community colleges, are offering dual enrollment in high school. And I think that's sold often to parents and students as a way to save money, but not all of those credits transfer. And so again, it's something to think about as you're looking at your college choices. The other thing about public 4-year colleges and universities is that going out of state to a public is increasingly becoming popular. In fact, there's new data that I just had in my newsletter this morning that nearly every public flagship university enrolled a smaller share of freshmen from within their own state this year than they did 20 years ago. So they've all been increasing their share of out-of-state students. But you're going to pay for that, as you can see here. On average, you're going to pay a lot more for an out-of-state public. And so don't ignore your in-state public because you think a public university somewhere else is better or will give you more aid. That will bring down the cost of attendance to where you live for an in-state public anyway. It's important to remember that don't discount your in-state public and be enamored by out-of-state publics that give out financial aid. And then finally, on the privates, don't assume they're out of reach. The average discount rate for all undergraduates at public universities is about 51%. So most people are only paying maybe about half of that sticker price at some private or university. So, apply and see what your financial aid offer might be, and we'll be talking more about those later, but don't discount privates altogether. So we have the public-private breakdown there. We have the 2- and 4-year breakdown, but another lens to filter your college search on is on this next slide, as you'll see, and that is by types of universities. There are really four big types of universities in the U.S. Research universities, regional colleges, liberal arts colleges, and community colleges. Now, typically research universities, and Rick Clark from Georgia Tech is at one of those tonight, public, or they're either public or private. They house multiple schools from arts and sciences to business to engineering to computer science. They're very research and focused. They're training graduate students is often a big part of their mission. The balance between research and teaching really should matter to you as a prospective student, because faculty members in certain disciplines might focus most of their time on research, while graduate students might pick up a portion of the teaching duties for you. So you really want to know, if you're going to go to a research university, how much access are you going to have to faculty? Regional colleges are sometimes referred to as master's colleges because they offer few, if any, doctoral programs. These schools also could be public or private. They focus less on research and much more on teaching. Now, their academic programs tend to be focused on more pre-professional programs. Their student body tends to be more from within the state or local states, so it's not as broad and a diverse student body as research universities in terms of geography, and they're not going to have as many graduate programs or as many programs overall as a research university. A liberal arts college is going to be smaller than a regional college. Most of their enrollments will be under 2,500 students, and they focus mostly on teaching, mostly on undergraduates. Faculty still conduct research, and they typically involve students in that work, so it's really good in that way to be at a liberal arts college. They usually have a lot fewer majors than regional colleges, and students tend to declare their major somewhat halfway through their time as an undergraduate. So they take more of a distribution of courses earlier on. And then, of course, you have the community colleges, which we talked about before. Now, if you flip the lens again on the next slide, you'll see a bunch of other factors that I think are really important to consider. One is location, right? Do you want to be in a big city? Do you want to be in a rural area? How much of a big of an institution do you want to be at? As I mentioned earlier, 40% of American colleges and universities have enrollments under 1,000 students. There are a couple hundred who have large universities, but what kind of size do you really want, especially coming out of high school? Selectivity. You probably hear a lot, and we'll talk a little bit about how hard it is to get into college these days, but most colleges accept most students. The average acceptance rate of a US college is about 65%, only about 200 accept fewer than 50%, so they would be considered selective. But as you think about your list, think about mixing up the selectivity of colleges. And then finally, majors, right? You may think you have a major in mind, but it's really important as you're looking at colleges, do they have a couple of different majors that might interest you in case you want to switch majors at some point. Now, I'm often asked how many colleges you should have on your list. So now that you've filtered all of these factors together, on the next slide, as you can see, we're going to talk about how do you balance that together, right? In many ways, in making your list, it's less about the numbers than it is about whatever number you have of colleges on this list, that it is balanced. Because I often see when things don't work out for students, what I often see is that their lists aren't balanced, right? They have a lot more academically stretched schools that are a little bit out of their range, and they are more likely to get denied from those. That tends, when people make their list, I think their first cut at that list often has a lot more stretch schools and a lot fewer and target and safe schools. So I think putting together this list is often a difficult task. I think that once you have that filter that I talked about earlier of do you want a public, do you want a private, do you want big, do you want small, do you want to be close to home or not, do they have your majors? I think you will get down to a smaller group of institutions, but then I think putting together a list that is balanced is sometimes challenging because colleges practice what they call holistic admissions. Most colleges practice this holistic admissions, meaning that there's not a simple cutoff. Well, if you score this SAT or you have this GPA, you're automatically in. Many factors matter in admissions. And above all, as you'll see on this next slide, that what matters first in admissions is really around the academic factors. You'll see on this next slide, things like test scores, your course selection in high school, and your grades. The thing that matters the most is your transcript, right? What are the courses you decided to take in high school, and what are the grades that you got in those courses, right? They want some consistency in those grades. They like grades that are pretty consistent or on their way up. If you had a tough transition in your first year or second year in high school, they don't like scores or test scores that are, grades that are all over the place. They really want something that shows more consistency. There's also a lot of discussion now about test scores, as you probably know. I put this piece in from the New York Times that was in on January 8th. A lot of schools, 500 plus schools, went test optional during the pandemic, and there's a lot of discussion among many of them about whether they go back to requiring test scores. MIT has already required them in admissions, but I think what's important here is that either way, taking the test, trying to get as best of a score as you could get on it, it's kind of critical so that at least you have a choice when you're making the application about whether to submit it or not. And you might have 10 schools and you might submit them to some, but not others. But having that score in hand and having a good score in hand, or as good as you can get, is kind of critical in at least making that decision. Doesn't mean you have to submit it everywhere, but having the score is critical. And as you'll learn later, at some places you actually might need that score in order to get merit aid and scholarships at some colleges and universities. Now, after all that, you might still not get in, right? You might have great test scores. You might have a great course selection. You might have great grades in those. And I think the thesis from my book, as you'll see in the next slide, is that colleges and universities, particularly the most selective ones, are getting so many great applications. As I regularly remind parents and students, they might be driving the process, right? You might be driving the process, figuring out that list, figuring out where you want to go. But at the end of the day, admissions is not about you, the applicant, right? It is about college's priorities. And so in any given year, they might want more full payers. They might want more kids from the Dakotas. And as I often say, just because a college has a 25% acceptance rate doesn't mean you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting in. And one way that colleges control this process is by having multiple deadlines, as you'll see on this next slide. We often talk about admissions as a system and as a process, but it really has multiple processes. And if you're a junior, you're probably already starting to think about this. Do I apply regular decision, which is usually due in January of my senior year, and I can apply to as many colleges as I want? Do I apply early decision, which is usually due around November 1st? You get a decision in usually in December, and that's a binding decision. So if you get in, you're going, and you have to withdraw your other applications. A lot of colleges are increasingly starting an EA. Process. And so as a result, early action is very much like early decision, where you put in an application on the early side, again, usually around November 1, you learn about getting in earlier. You might learn in December or January or early February, but you have until May to kind of make a decision. So it's not binding like early decision. Now, why do they do this? Why is the reason they have so many rounds? As you can see in the next slide, the number of applications to colleges and universities has increased dramatically in the last 20 years. You can see back in 2001, you had fewer than 3 million applications filed. Now you're closing in on 10 million applications in many cases. And this is just looking at basically four-year colleges that are over 1,000 students. So it's even higher number than that. I think last year was like 11 million applications or so. But this graphic is only looking at those institutions that have over 1,000 students in terms of enrollment. And as you can see, applications are up, but acceptances have not risen at the same amount. And as you can see, enrollment is pretty flat. So what this means is that, especially at the most selective colleges and universities, we're seeing that they're accepting maybe the same number of students as they have in the past, but because their application numbers have gone up, their acceptance rates are actually dropping. And so what this is really leading to a lot of uncertainty for colleges and universities, because as you can see, they could accept more students in some cases, but enrollment is pretty flat, right? So you could apply as a student to 10 colleges, you could get accepted to maybe 5, but you can only go to 1, right? The yield, that's the most important number for colleges and universities. How many are they going to yield? This is why colleges love early decision. And as you see on the next slide, you can see that many colleges and universities have started to take, on this next slide, you can see they started to take more and more of their classes in early decision. 60%, 50%, 55% of their classes come in early. Well, what that means is that those are all students who are committed. It's almost like 100% yield. And that means you as a student, if you're thinking about applying to a college that has a high number of early decision admits, you have to decide whether it's worth it to you to apply in regular decision, because it's going to be harder to get into because they filled so much of their class early. And as you can see in the next slide, the early decision admit rate at many colleges that have leaned into early decision is higher than it is in regular decision. So this is a strategy I know that juniors are probably thinking about now. Do I want to apply early? Now, the problem with applying early, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is that you cannot, because you get one acceptance and you get, you're committed to going there, if you get accepted, you cannot necessarily compare financial aid offers as a result from multiple institutions in the spring. And so you really are committed to going there financially as well, and it's something important to remember. One final thing on early. As you can see in this next slide, a number of colleges and universities have also leaned into early action. And why do they like early action? Well, they like early action because they are able to get a number of applications in early. They're able to spread out that huge increase in applications. But the big story of the last 2 years has been that more and more colleges that have early action, they've been seeing their applications coming early. So Clemson last year, they got 58 total applications last year. 26,000 of them came in early, right? And so they ended up deferring 15,000 from early to regular because they just didn't have enough time to look at these applications even earlier. So you may apply early thinking, I'm going to get a decision, and that decision you might get is a deferral. So it's important to remember, again, this is where the process really is at the advantage of the college or university. You might think, well, I'm going to apply early to find out early. At some schools you might, but at some schools you might just end up getting a deferral. And that is one of the risks of applying early in terms of if you really want to know, did I get in to this place, you may not get the answer you want, and the answer might be a deferral. So I want to bring in a good friend of mine who I have known for years, Rick Clark, who is at Georgia Tech. Rick is Executive Director of Strategic Student Access. He's former Executive Director of Undergraduate Admissions at Georgia Tech. He's also co-author with Brennan Bernard of The Truth About College Admission, a family guide to getting in and staying together. It's a great book. I highly recommend it to anybody out there. And so I want to talk a little bit with Rick tonight about the process. How does admissions really work from somebody who's been on the other side of the desk? And so Rick, welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
So Rick, tell me what happens when an application shows up at Georgia Tech. Can you walk us through a typical review? There was a headline many years ago in the Wall Street Journal and a story that I think featured you in Georgia Tech. The headline was, "Some elite colleges review an application in 8 minutes or less." So are you telling me we spend all this time getting ready for college, touring college, doing test prep, completing applications, and it could be over in 8 minutes? What does a typical review look like?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, that headline is sort of like pictures of all of us that are out there on the internet that we wish we could probably go and scrub. You know, was not the best headline ever, but I mean, I guess the truth is that that's sure, yeah, for some students, that's right. It could be over in 8 minutes because you know, they're applying from a school that has 200 other students applying, and they haven't sort of taken the classes or made the grades, right? And it's kind of like progressive cuts in soccer. I mean, you show up to a 3-day tryout, and after one, maybe they've seen enough. It doesn't have to go through multiple layers. But to answer your question, the way that it works at Georgia Tech, and really for a lot of schools, is that we start out with a reader. There are times and there are some schools where this is a synchronous process. People are literally in the same room or maybe on Zoom together looking at applications. For us, that's not the case. We have 2 different readers that'll look at each application, but one person's going to go in, they're going to do their read, they're going to kind of make their notes, they're going to score various parts of that application, look at the grades and the rigor of curriculum, what they're doing outside the classroom. They'll read the essays, recommendation letters, and make a recommendation of whether they should, as you said earlier, admit, defer, or deny, or possibly waitlist, depending on where you are in the process. And then another person's going to go in and do the same thing. If those two decisions line up, then that would be a case where it's not going to necessarily need to advance, right? Especially if two people have said this is a no. But in many cases, what happens after that is it goes to what we'd call committee, where you're bringing in additional and typically more senior folks to look through. It could be by cohort, right? You said this earlier with publics versus privates. We do this at Georgia Tech where we're going to read out of state with a different lens than we're going to read in state. And so we could do, out of state committee on North Carolina and just kind of, look with that type of a lens. We'll do that where we're doing it by major, same thing, right? We might sort of say, okay, today we're going to look at all students who are applying, with this particular major, because we know we have certain goals based on where you're from or what you might major in, et cetera. So there are multiple layers. We also have faculty that get involved, and that's going to, of course, not be the case at every school. But as you said earlier, the more selective you are, the more layers you have. And those are some of the things they're looking for and some of the conversations that are being had. It's driven, yes, partly by numbers, but a lot of it's being driven by what are your goals? How many admits do you have to give? And what are you trying to achieve with that class?
Great. I want to dig a little bit deeper into different parts of the application. So what's the role of the test score at Georgia Tech? How do you advise students who are, you require it, but how do you advise students who are applying to colleges where testing is not required, but where we know a lot of applicants still submit scores. So what's the role that test scores play at Georgia Tech, and how do you recommend students kind of prepare for the test, but also what do they do in this test optional world?
Yeah, sure. You're right. Georgia Tech does require, and so to kind of answer that question, like how does it play in? It is one of many factors within that holistic review. So, again, we're going to kind of focus in on where did you go to school? What did you take? How did you do? How does that compare to the other students that are applying from your school? How does that look maybe even to students that have applied in the past? And that's going to help us. That's going to get us a long way. Test scores are going to come into that conversation as well. And, at a place like Georgia Tech, for sure, everybody has one, right? It is required. And so it is standardized in that regard across the entire applicant pool. Now, for us, the truth is most students, we had 60,000 apps this year. Our average was almost 1,400 for the applicants. That's the top 10% of global test takers. And the truth is, at some point, in many cases, an SAT or an ACT is not by any means the determining factor because you're kind of splitting hairs there. What I would say, though, is for schools that are test optional, and I think that test optional has brought, unfortunately, a little more consternation to this conversation and ecosystem. But the couple quick tips would be, number one, looking at the middle 50% of the prior year's admitted pool. So all schools, or almost every school, is going to put out a profile of last year's class. What was that middle 50%? So let's say a school says, all right, from the 25th to 75th percentile of kids that were admitted last year, the band of those scores was a 1,400 to a 1,500. You know that 25% of their admits had below it, 25% had above it. That is helpful. And that's informative, but since they're test optional, it has inflated that middle 50%. And so one of the things I would recommend is that students and parents, no question is off the table, and asking schools, if they can't find it, what percentage of your class was test optional? What percentage was not? And for those that, did send in tests, like how did that admit rate vary from those that did not? So I think that asking and looking for that information is really the way to go if you're applying to a school that's test optional. Of course, you can also work within your school. A lot of schools have pretty good data, historical data through Maya Learning or SCORE or Naviance. So you might find that even in your own high school, there's some helpful statistics, not always perfect, but informative anyway, that can assist you.
Really helpful, Rick. And at many places, I know this is probably not true at Georgia Tech, but at many places, merit aid might be tied to test scores, right? And GPAs, right? So they might use GPAs and a combination of GPAs and test scores in terms of awarding aid.
No question. I mean, a big one here in the South, of course, is Auburn. You know, we see a lot of overlap with Auburn in our applicant pool. And, you know, one thing I guess it's kind of nice here, I mean, because part of the flack that admission takes is it's not transparent, right? But in a lot of these cases that you're referring to, that is. A lot of schools are going to be very upfront about if you have X plus, you know, Y, then this is how much money you will be awarded if you're admitted. And so you're absolutely right, particularly in the South, particularly for some of our larger flagship institutions and other publics. That test score can absolutely come with money, and the GPA plus test score for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about that GPA. What are you looking for in the high school transcript? And you know, there are 25,000 plus high schools in the US alone. You know, how do you compare students from different high schools?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that you'll hear from any selective school and even schools that aren't as selective is they do typically have people on their staff that are basically charged with really understanding their market. So you don't have to understand all 25,000, right? Or here in Georgia, all 650. You only have to understand your market. And one of the ways we do that is through a school profile. And I'm guessing if there are a lot of sophomores on the call, they may not, and parents of sophomores too, like they might not even know what that is or know where to find it. But typically you can just sort of Google or go onto your school's website and look at your profile. This is something that comes along with the transcripts. And it is really a touchstone for admissions. This is something that helps us tremendously because while we may have some key feeder schools where we're familiar and get those students year after year, there are always new high schools, either literally new, created new, or ones that we've never had an applicant pool or haven't had in the last 5 years. And so what we do is we start by saying, all right, what was available to you? What could you have taken? All right, what did you choose to take and when? That matters. And then how did you do? And how did you do along the way? So it is both, yes, GPA ultimately, but also the trend of that. How did you arrive at that GPA? And of course, your choice, right? How much were you stretching and pushing, particularly in certain subjects? And then at some schools more than other, particularly in some subjects that are aligned with your major. So that's sort of where we start and how we operate. And, you know, without a doubt, I think schools would tell you that's really primarily where you start. Question number one, where does this kid go to school? What could they have taken? What did they take? How did they do? And how did they do along the way?
And how do you compare high schools?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, and increasingly with data, one of the things you can do, and one of the things we're absolutely doing is we're looking at performance of students who are already on our campus. I mean, that's one of the best things that you can do. Now, of course, you don't always have, you know, a lot of that data if it's as I said, a new school, but we don't really get too much in the business of literally comparing one school to the other. Our job is to say, what do we know is predictive of success for us? Has the student taken those type of classes, done things outside the classroom that demonstrate that they can sort of juggle both inside and outside pressures, which we know is the college experience. And then when possible and where possible, we're also looking at, okay, how have students from this high school done on our campus, and how can we learn from that to make good decisions going forward? So we're not really so much in the comparison game of school to school. It's more understanding that institution is that lining up for a good preparation success, you know, for us.
So we have a lot of sophomores and juniors and parents of sophomores and juniors on the call, and even freshmen. But let's, how can they best prepare? What one thing would you recommend to them in terms of what they can do now so that they don't have regrets when they're applying to college?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it earlier. This concept of like a balanced list comes from an open mind, in my opinion. You know, and even as a sophomore, I mean, you know, you're typically getting stuff, that's a technical term, in the mail, right, from colleges, emails from colleges. Schools are coming and emailing you to say, we're going to be at your high school, we're going to be at the hotel in your city. Keeping an open mind, not throwing that stuff out. I mean, I met with a friend earlier today. Her daughter is a senior, and what she was saying after all of these conversations we've had over the last 2 years, she just found out, about a couple admission offers here recently, and she had a solid private school in Georgia that she got into, and a public school in Virginia that she got into, and in the end, it is about her having a choice, right? She got to look at what the cost was going to be. She got to look at where she wanted to go. And those schools are very different in many ways, including selectivity. But she gets to make a choice. And I think that too often as a sophomore or junior, you get myopic and you're just like, here's where I want to go. It's the small group of schools. I'm not even going to go visit other places. I'm not going to look at this stuff if it comes in the mail to me. And starting broad is just so important. And I actually equate that to the way colleges operate. Like, we don't go real narrow with our pool. The way we build a class starts really broad, and it narrows eventually. And people could go out and Google for the admission funnel, but I think that's how you should be thinking. Stay open, stay broad. As you get closer down, as you become a junior, as you become a senior, as you become an applicant, an admitted student, then it narrows. But to start narrow is a huge mistake, and it's usually going to end up in a bad spot.
Rick, I talked a little bit about that this is not a process, right? It's not one single process that every college and university follows, but there's many parts to this process. And I explained regular decision, which the majority of applicants apply regular decision, meaning they apply around January 1 and they find out a decision, usually sometimes on a rolling basis. So they might find out pretty quickly. They might find out in March, and then they decide by May 1st where they're going. But increasingly, as I mentioned earlier, schools are adding earlier rounds. They're adding early decision, or already had early decision, and leaning more into that, meaning it's a binding decision, or early action, which seems that more colleges are either doing early action, meaning you apply early, it's not binding, but you could find out earlier. They're either adding early action or they're getting overwhelmed with applications for early action. What's going on? Why is early action more popular with students? And it also seems to be more popular with institutions as well.
Yeah. So I can tell you on the institution side, sort of where that comes from and why, and why EA maybe more than ED. I mean, first of all, as you said earlier with early decision, because you're not going to get to like shop that around. I mean, it's typically the schools that have the deeper pockets, have the ability to meet student need at a higher level, that are going to have early decision plans. That's largely true. Most schools are not going to be able to do that, Georgia Tech included. The reason that you add an EA plan is a couple of reasons. One of those is simply volume and spreading the load. If we, let's say, look, if it was up to me and I could just like operate in a vacuum, I think having a February 1 deadline, right, would be great, because to your point, seniors get to go a little longer. They get to discover more about themselves. They get to see their fall grades. They're probably a little bit more, they're obviously closer to college and know more of what they want. That's just not realistic. We have to spread the load. Again, 60,000 applications this year. If they all came in on February 28th and 29th, which they would, by the way, we in our slate, which is what we use to read applications and receive applications, 60,000 applications, almost 50%, 48% came in on 6 different days, and those were the day of or the day before each of our 3 deadlines, right? So we label this procrastinators in our slate report, but that's just sort of tongue in cheek. But regardless, part of that is spreading the load. You just have to. The second thing is yield, and you alluded to this earlier, but if you can get an admit out to a student, so for us, for Georgia in particular, we put out a couple thousand admits, right, in December. And that means that we're able to start working on convincing that student that Georgia Tech is the right place for them. And if we can show them that love of the admit, if we can get to them before the winter break, if we can invite them to come to programs, if we can start connecting them with faculty, we are going to have a better chance of yielding them. And then the last thing that dictates that is simply competition, that we don't operate in a vacuum. And since other schools, as you said, are operating this way and moving earlier, some of that is your hand gets forced and you just have to. So those are the primary reasons that institutions have early action. And for students, I mean, they're just operating within the system that unfortunately in many ways has been created. And I mean, your data shows it, and people are very aware of it, that in many cases it's true. Yes, you have a better chance in some schools than others, and nobody can refute that based on the numbers. But the other thing is, and I get this, I mean, as humans in general, like, we want to know and we want information. And if I'm able to apply early action somewhere and it's not binding, and I have a chance to know earlier, I'm going to do it, because then if I don't get in or if I get deferred, there's still application deadlines open for me later. And if I get in and that's my place, man, I'm done. I can just really enjoy my senior year. So I think that's those are some of the factors driving it for students.
Great. Rick, one last question before I let you go for the evening. I mean, this current admissions process is really kind of wholly unfamiliar, I think, to most of today's parents if they went to college themselves, right? They probably went to college maybe in the 80s, early 90s. It seems so much more competitive to them. So what's your advice? You wrote this great book, as I said earlier, The Truth About College Admission, a family guide to getting in. And I think the most important part of this title or subtitle is staying together, right? What's your advice for remaining sane throughout this?
Yeah. I mean, and that is true. We really tried to center this on conversations and families and asking good questions and listening to each other and checking your ego and things that are just not hard. I mean, not easy to do. They're tough. I think that, in your question, it's true. Like, is college admission fair? Absolutely not. Not in selective places, that supply and demand is really dictating a low admit rate. It is about institutional mission, and mission sort of drives admission. And so I think one of the big things that I just keep coming back to is this idea that there are many things outside of your control. But if you can stay sort of focused on, all right, I'm a good student. I'm pushing and preparing myself. And there's so many schools out there, as you said, and the average admit rate is basically 65 to 67%. Like, this idea of how you go about it, both being a good student and a community member in high school, and also how you go about it as a family, like really just sort of believing that it is not ultimately going to be so much about where you end up, but sort of how you end up. Especially with what we're seeing with mental health, especially as what we're seeing with sort of broken kind of relationships or burnout along the way. Like, if you can show up healthy and engaged and as a family supportive and like understanding, like, we had choices and options and I chose this place over my other choices and options, even if there were some that were taken away from me, I still had control. And now I'm excited to be here and I'm going to maximize that experience. And I really think that, that's where we are. And that's what you can control, and focusing on that is really going to take you a long way.
Yeah, Rick, somebody once told me, kind of control what you can control, right? So, do well in high school, take the SAT or ACT, try to score well, prepare for that, right? Do your activities and things like that, and then kind of let the chips fall where they may on the other side of the desk, because you can't really control that, right? You have no idea who's going to read your application, how they're going to feel, or what the institution needs at that particular moment.
I mean, think about what you said earlier about in-state and out-of-state. I mean, a school decides from a revenue standpoint, they're going to shift 5% more in-state or out-of-state that year. And to your point earlier, like, just because they have a 25% admit rate doesn't mean it's for you. And it just got chipped into because a decision that way outside of your control was made that you'll never necessarily know about.
Rick Clark, Georgia Tech, former executive director of undergraduate admissions, now the executive director of strategic student access. Get his book, The Truth About College Admissions, that he co-wrote with Brendan Bernard. a family guide to getting in and staying together. Rick, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me. Take care.
And don't go anywhere, folks, because I want to talk a little bit about rankings and paying for college now, and then we'll try to get to a question or two if we have any. So let's talk a little bit about the rankings. I often get questions about the rankings. Probably the best known of them all are U.S. News and World Report, which have been around since the 1980s. People always say, well, if U.S. News and World Report would go away, the rankings would go away, and that's not true because everybody does rankings. Princeton Review, Wall Street Journal, Money. I just put out a few here. And I think the way that I would use the rankings if you're starting the college search is twofold. One is learn a little bit more about their methodology. So let me talk about that first. Let's look at the next slide where you'll see the U.S. News and World Report methodology. So no matter what ranking you're going to use and look at, make sure you know how they measured it. And as you can see in this slide, these are all the different weights that go into the U.S. News and World Report rankings for an institution. And as you can see, the biggest weight is given to something they call a peer assessment, which is a survey they send out to college leaders, presidents, and admissions deans. And they basically say, what do you think of these colleges? Usually they're their peer colleges or colleges that they know about. That is the biggest part of the U.S. News and World Report rankings. Now, if that is important to you, what other people in higher education think about that college or university, then certainly use those rankings. Now, the Wall Street Journal, others use different weights. They look more, Wall Street Journal looks more at outcomes, looks more at how much you're going to make as a student, as a graduate. But whatever ranking you use, make sure the first thing you do is go to the methodology to figure out is what is important to them also important to you. The other way that I use the rankings is that I'm always looking at, well, I know this college. What are some of the colleges around it in the rankings? I think it opens up, as Rick talked earlier, you want to have a big funnel at the top of colleges and universities. And the way that you get those names, the way that you think more broadly is by, well, I know this college or I'm interested in this college. What colleges are kind of around it in the rankings that you may not have heard of? So that's a good way to use the rankings, but start with methodology first and then look at that. Okay, so now you're ready to make your college list, and you are making it, as we see on the next slide, you're going to make it on academic fit, you're going to make it on social fit. Well, don't forget about financial fit. It's important to remember that finances play a role in going to college. Now, you might say, well, the financial fit of a university or the financial aid of a university is just as much of a black box as getting in, and that's somewhat true, but we kind of know how most families pay for college. So on the next slide, you'll see a great graphic that comes from How America Pays for College. It's a national survey that Sallie Mae does every year. And you could see from this that at a private or public university that actually what parents and students contribute on their own is actually pretty similar. $11,657 at a four-year public, $13,168. Now remember, these are averages. But what is important to remember is that purple part, right? Scholarships and grants from the institution and some from state or federal government make up a significant portion of that sticker price. So you might look at that sticker price and you say, I can't afford $26,000 for a four-year in-state public, or I can't afford $40,000 in tuition for a four-year private university. You have to remember that coming right off the top there, at many places are scholarships and grants, and that some of these are need-based aid, and some of them are based on non-need-based aid. In other words, they're based on how well, as Rick mentioned earlier, how well you perform on the SAT or ACT, how well you perform in high school with your GPA. And as he mentioned, there are a number of colleges and universities that actually put out charts every year that shows if you score this on the SAT or ACT and you have this GPA, this is how much of an institutional grant that you can expect. And I think that's important to realize how you're going to pay for that total cost of attendance. And as you're putting together your list, one of the things that I encourage parents, and if we look at the next slide, is to really find those institutions that in my last book I called the buyers among colleges and universities. Now, this term really only applies to how they think about financial aid, but the buyers are those institutions that need to give out institutional financial aid in order to in order to fill seats. And so they give out a lot of institutional financial aid, often as a discount to families, even if they don't have need. And this comes from something called the Common Data Set. This is available for almost every college and university out there. If you're thinking about a college, go to Google their name, Emory University, for example, and look for their common data set. Almost every college, not every single one, but most colleges and universities will put up their common data set. And it is common, so every single common data set is similar from college to university. Obviously, the numbers are different, but the format is the same. And you're going to go to this section around finances, and you're going to look at this line called scholarships and grants, because that makes up that purple section in that previous slide. And this is the portion, as you can see here, this is a school that gave out $77 million in institutional need-based aid. That is dollars that came from the institution to the student who had financial need. But they gave out $74 million to students who didn't have financial need. And so it's really important as you're looking at these to look for schools that give out a lot of non-need based aid. And you can see later on in section N there how many students they gave out those non-need based aid dollars to. So did they give them out to a few, or did they give it out to a lot? So you want to look for these buyers among colleges and universities, and you're looking for those institutions that spend a lot of money on non-need based aid and institutions that are giving it to a large proportion of the student body. Both of those numbers you can find on the common data set. Now, in this next slide, I'm just giving you some examples of colleges and universities, which are very similar in many ways academically. So you might consider the University of Michigan, which in my parlance I call a seller. They don't have to spend as much money on need-based aid because they get a lot more applications, for example, than the University of Pittsburgh, which has to spend a lot more money on non-need-based aid. So they give out a lot of merit aid. University of North Carolina gives out little in merit aid. Clemson University gives out more. Emory and Tulane, Carnegie Mellon, and Case Western. So as you're thinking about this, you might say, okay, I'm considering Carnegie Mellon, but what are some other colleges that are similar academically? And then I'm going to go into their common data set, or you could come to my website and get a list of these buyers and sellers, and you can see what are the institutions that give out more aid. But the important thing to remember about non-need-based aid is that it's often based on the merit of the student coming in the door. In other words, what are their high school grades and what are their test scores? And this is why it's important, even if you're applying to a test optional school, is for many of their scholarships, you might want to ask, do you require a test score? And some of them do. Some of them, as Rick said, are very transparent on what it takes in terms of a test score to get that scholarship. So it's one reason, as I said earlier, take the test, prepare for the test, take the test, have that score, because you're going to use it for different things. You might not use it to apply to a college, but you might use it for financial aid. So I'm often asked, and this is where I want to end tonight on the next slide, I'm often asked, well, how do I really kind of dig deeper into the rankings to try to find what often are called hidden gems? What are those colleges that are maybe a little bit easier to get into, maybe will give me some merit aid, but that I'm going to have a good experience, I'm actually going to graduate, right? What you're looking for in that, and again, these numbers, you could go to bigfuture.collegeboard.org, you could go to the collegescorecard.ed.gov, you could go to US News and World Report, you could go to many of the other rankings to find some of these numbers. But really what you're looking for, especially for those target schools or the safety schools I was talking about earlier, you really want to find a school that has selectivity in the low 50s, maybe closer to 60%, sometimes a little bit higher. Once you get under 50%, that's where these more selective colleges and admissions is a little bit more random. You want to look at graduation and retention rates. You really want to make sure if I'm going to go there, am I going to graduate? Now, you might, most selective colleges are well into the 90s. Obviously some students are always going to leave a college. Some students may not graduate, or they may not graduate on time. So you're really looking for a graduation and retention rate around 80%. And then finally, you're going to look for a buyer with merit aid. I think if you combine all those things together, you're going to find a lot of colleges that are really good places for you and your family. So with that, Michael, I'm going to turn it back to you. I don't know if you have any Q&A, but I know you also want to tell us a little bit more about Huntington Test Prep as well.
Yes, no, and thank you, Jeff. I mean, so much great information. We've got a gazillion questions that have come in, and so you're going to have, that's going to be your homework. You're going to have to go through a lot of those. But I did want to talk a little bit about the SAT, ACT prep program, and as we've kind of talked about during the course of this event, is a really critical exam, even if you're applying to a school that's test optional, as Jeff was just talking about. The importance, the connection to the merit aid or the financial aid that you could possibly be receiving is really, really critical. And if you're a sophomore or junior on the call tonight, or a parent listening in for a sophomore or junior, it's really critical to make sure that you're getting that test prep in. And so who does Huntington help? Huntington helps students improve their scores and really help to open doors to their top choices. And how do we do this? Well, we start by doing a comprehensive evaluation, a full practice test. This is part of this model, this personalized model. Everybody seems to have maybe similar challenges, right? People say, well, I don't test well, or I have trouble with math, or I have trouble with this. But at the end of the day, really, all of those challenges are very unique to people. And so we really want to get to each student's strengths and weaknesses. Where do they excel? Where are they deficient? To really focus in on the areas where we can make those improvements. When we pinpoint those strengths and weaknesses, we can design that program that's really tailored so we can achieve the goals that your student has. And then we develop that personalized exam prep plan based upon all the results that we do with those practice tests and the conversations we have. The student then gets set up with certified tutors. They begin that prep. There's a lot of flexibility too, depending upon the time frame that you're working from. We do the online prep. There's supplemental resources that we provide. And students that complete, as I alluded to at the beginning of this webinar, students that complete the SAT, ACT prep programs see an average increase of 229 points on the SAT and 5.4 points on the ACT. And when you consider the value, maybe if you are applying to a school that is not, it says that they're test optional, it just gives you that other little benefit in your high school resume and your portfolio to help you achieve a better chance of admission. So we're really proud. We got a lot of great trained and experienced teachers and a lot of different prep choices. So my advice to you, go to huntingtonhelps.com, check out the website. There's a phone number. You can contact us, speak to one of our education specialists. We'll put you in touch with the center closest to you and get you into the program that you need. So let's dive into, I want to at least get into it. We're going to probably go a little bit over 8 o'clock, Jeff, but I did want to get into at least one question, and then I wanted to ask you to provide a couple of key takeaways, right? Because there was certainly a huge volume of information that we've covered. But so this parent asks, my student's junior year is midway, my child, and this gets into the SAT, my child doesn't think the SAT is necessary for the schools they're applying to. I thought they were. What are the pros and cons with not taking the SAT, or I guess with taking the SAT? What are the pros and cons? That's what the parent wants to know.
Well, I mean, okay, so the pros of taking the SAT is that you kind of know how you perform, right? And you could just figure out after you take the SAT, am I close to getting a potential scholarship at some of the schools that I'm looking at, right? Again, remember I talked earlier, there are no hard cutoffs for admissions often at schools, but there are hard cutoffs at some schools for scholarships. And so it could be, for example, that you take the SAT and you realize, wow, if I just increase my next SAT score by 20 points or 50 points, I could qualify for a merit-based scholarship at some of these colleges I'm looking at. So that's one reason that's a pro of taking it. Another pro of taking it is that you might, again, decide, well, wow, I got a really good score, right? And that can help me get into maybe places that my high school transcript is good, but this would actually shine a little bit more light on me as an applicant, and that's a pro. And again, just having the score, once you have it, then you could decide, right? Because the position you don't want to be in is you're about to apply to college and you're like, oh boy, I wish I had a score right now. You don't want to be put in that position because you can always take the test and decide not to use it. But you can't, a day before, as Rick said, right? Most of us are, procrastinators. You can't decide the day before that you're going to take the test. I mean, the con is it takes time, right? It takes time to prepare for the test, to take test prep, and to actually take the test, right? But I think in many ways the pros outweigh the cons, especially if you just want to see how am I going to do and where does that place me.
Yeah, and to think about it too, it's not. I mean, going into a college or university, it's a huge investment. So even if you're thinking about investing several weeks of time, you're talking about years and the money and the possible outcome. I think it's one of those factors that you got to take into account, that this is not like just going out and making a simple purchase. You're really making an investment in your future when you consider studying and prepping for that exam. So really quickly, if you don't mind, a couple of key takeaways. There's a lot of information, and I do want to remind people too that we've been recording this event. I know people have been asking about the websites that you've referenced, Jeff, and how do I find this? How do I do that? We are going to make this available on demand, and we'll do some follow-up as well as some outreach to get you the information to make sure you don't miss anything. But before we let people go, a couple of great takeaways that you think are really important to kind of sum up all this information.
Yeah, so I think first of all, if you're a sophomore or a junior, start thinking about those filters I was talking about earlier. What kind of college experience do you want? Big, small, close by, public, private, liberal arts college versus a big research university. Start there. Once you're there, then start to look at colleges that fit that criteria. Start broad, as Rick said tonight. Look at the rankings to say, okay, I'm interested in Boston University. What is a university that is similar to that in the rankings and is similar to the type of college and university that I'm looking at? Then look at their academic profile and see where you fit within that academic profile in terms of test scores and grades and so forth, and make sure that you have that balanced list that I was talking about earlier. And then just enjoy high school and do the work in high school that's important, because at the end of the day, as I said, a lot of this is out of your control. It's, as Rick said, it's institutional priorities and so forth like that. But then if you do have a balanced list, you're going to have choices at the end, right? You might get rejected by a few colleges, but you're also going to get accepted by a bunch, and you're going to have those choices at the end. And so, all of these websites I mentioned earlier, the college scorecard will give you basically a lot of college data from the US government. Big Future, which is on the College Board, will also allow you to filter colleges a lot by those criteria that I was talking about earlier. And if you want to learn more about financial aid and the buyers and sellers I was explaining tonight, that's at jeffselingo.com, which is my website.
Oh, that's great. Jeff Selingo, author of Who Gets In and Why, A Year Inside College Admissions, New York Times bestselling author. And we really appreciate everything that you do, Jeff, and helping people with the college, navigating this whole process. It can be complex, it can be scary, and having an expert like you to really guide people through this, I think helps to settle people down, and we really appreciate it. Certainly subscribe to Jeff's newsletter, go to his website, and we'll certainly reach out to everybody in the next few days with the recording, and then do some follow-up on the Q&A. Jeff, thank you so much. Really appreciate you.
It was great to be here. Thank you so much.
Yep, everyone, thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event. This concludes tonight's event, and take care. Stay well, everybody.